Hello, and welcome to a special edition for the College Football National Championship. We are doing a Showdown slate preview with Cody and Chris K. Of course, I'm Peter Jennings. Guys, this is fun. College football, I've been grinding the majority of the year. Chris, you have done an amazing job grinding as well. And of course, we have the Showdown specialist. Cody, how you guys doing here in the new year? And are you excited for this national championship game? I'll go to you first, Chris.
Good. It's kind of a peak of at the end of the season here. We get a fun game with some interesting offenses, and hopefully what should be a tight game just for general entertainment purposes. But excited for tonight for sure.
Hey, how you doing? You excited to play? Are you going to play this slate? Looks like
I am going to play this slate. I'm happy to jump in here in January for my first college football showdown slate, my first college football slate of the entire season, and happy to ride your guys' coattails. Hopefully I can glean some information from your analysis, and maybe I can provide some details on how we should be attacking the showdown slate from that angle of things as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think this will be great. Obviously, it's one game. I think Chris has grinded college football as well as anyone. And obviously in a showdown slate, the rules and how you're attacking from a game theory perspective is really important. Just taking a high look at the game, Georgia's a huge favorite and the market is moving towards Georgia. You have lines between 12.5 and 13.5, depending where you are making the bet. Make sure to shop for the best price if you are going to bet. DraftKings still has Georgia minus 12.5, whereas FanDuel is at 13.5, and that's a real edge between those two books. So if you're looking at TCU, grab that plus 13.5. If you're looking for Georgia, grab that 12.5. From a total perspective, it's somewhere in the 63 to 64 range. Most books at 63.5, a couple books at 64. Chris, I'll kick it to you. What's your kind of expectation overall for this game? Obviously, based on the line, Georgia's going to pop, kind of in the models based on their implied team total.
Yeah, I think Georgia is going to be seen heavily, and I think that's where we're going to have to be a little bit unique and make sure that our rules are kind of set up in the correct way to take advantage of some of these lower owned guys. But I think from just a game perspective, it's to me, it's going to be one of two things, right? Georgia, I think, blows them out at halftime at Super Bowl. We had too good of a semifinal matchups to have another good one. So I could see a huge lead from Georgia at half, and otherwise I think TCU, it just depends. Can they get the explosive plays that they've shown all year? They're top three in everything from 30 yards and above in terms of long plays in college football. So it'll be interesting to see, but I'm hoping that TCU can capitalize on some of these big plays. I think Marvin Harrison showed that defensive, that secondary can be exploited a little bit. So I'm just kind of hoping that they can kind of put together a good offensive game plan to stick with and stay with Georgia, as they should probably score a good bit here tonight.
Yeah, and just as a reminder, obviously, if you're watching the show, the college football product on the Solver is free. It's powered by the team over at the Solver and ETR. Cody, when just kind of looking at this, obviously you've played a lot of NFL showdown, your first college football showdown. When you start looking at teams, what are kind of some of your high-level thoughts when building?
Yeah, and for everyone following along, I'll have the solver pulled up here. We'll also be toggling back and forth, kind of looking at a top plays article that Chris wrote up for us as well. That's a free article on the site today. But the first thing that stood out to me from just kind of a high level perspective, obviously 12.5, 13.5 point spread, you're going to see a lot of Georgia heavy lineups. I just didn't expect it to be this stark as it is here. You can see the stat construction breakdown from the solver. I ran 1,000 lineups last night through the solver. I wanted to see what type of spread I would get. You can see there's no 5-1 TCU heavy builds appearing in the top 1,000 optimals. You see 51% of those top 1,000 optimals were 4 Bulldogs, 2 TCU Horned Frogs. It just struck me as an opportunity in a championship game that if you think this game plays a little bit closer than Vegas does, if you wanted to lean a little bit more TCU heavy, or even if you just went 3-3, you can see only 24% of the top 1,000 optimals went 3-3. I think from just a very high level perspective, if you're coming from the NFL side, where you know that this spread is generally not nearly as concentrated as it is or it projects to be on tonight's slate, you can maybe get a little bit more unique by just flipping the build a little bit and maybe playing a little bit more TCU heavy, or finding ways to get more unique pieces in those very popular for Georgia to TCU lineups.
Yeah, and from a betting perspective and just kind of thinking about this slate, we're on Georgia. A friend of mine and partner at Unabated, Rufus Peabody, said he made the game. Georgia minus 18. Basically, every sharp I know is on Georgia. We'll have a big position on Georgia. So I'm trying to think through a clean sweat, but still trying to be unique, because I agree a lot of the builds are going to be these 4-2s. I'll probably run some 5-1 onslaughts for sure tonight. But I am trying to think through ways that I can build teams while still being heavy on Georgia. Let's talk through some of the top plays, Chris. And I think we have to start with the Georgia guys. Obviously, Bennett's going to be the top overall play. And then there are pieces that you can kind of put together with him. I was happy to see Adonai Mitchell score a touchdown. I needed Ohio State to win, but at least it was a Mitchell TD to get there to end that game. But how are you thinking through kind of these plays overall?
Yeah, Stetson in the Georgia offense is pretty unique because he can run it just like Max Duggan. And he also has a top running back that can catch it out of the backfield. So I think you can get pretty interesting with your lineups just because, using Stetson with Kenny McIntosh is not an issue. Those two can work together. You have Brock Bowers, an incredible tight end prospect for the NFL that has had a huge couple of first seasons at Georgia, and then A.D. Mitchell there as the top receiver. But you can get unique with your builds just because they use 6 or 7 different receivers that could potentially be that receiver 3, receiver 4. So, using some variations, using some rules, I think you can try to find something that's not going to be a duplicate here in the bigger tournaments. But Stetson, I think it's going to be the heavy favorite to be the captain from everybody. And then I think you could also see Bowers, Mitchell be incredibly high owned, and with good reason. I mean, both of them are going to get be favorites to score through the air. So I think ultimately you're looking at those top 4 guys, and then you're trying to figure out which one of those value lower type guys like Arian Smith, Kyrus Jackson, Dominic Blaylock, those types, to see where you can get a little bit more unique.
Absolutely. I mean, I think part of the challenge with Georgia all year is they're just huge favorites, and it was hard to figure out who to play. And then, we get to these games where they're more competitive and they can be pushed. I expect a big game out of Brock Bowers, who didn't have a huge game against Ohio State, but he's been the leading pass catcher. And then the other interesting thing, like you mentioned, is all the receivers plus the running backs. I mean, McIntosh is obviously the main guy, but, especially if this game does lean heavily towards Georgia, I have no issue playing multiple running backs. And that's kind of some of the thoughts. It's like, okay, if Georgia blows them out, what does that type of team look like? And to me, it's going to include multiple running backs. Dawan Edwards is certainly in play. And even Kendall Milton, I could see getting there at the end of the game in the event that this is like, a 28-point differential or something like that. So I'm liking these onslaughts, but in the competitive games, what are you guys thinking for lineup builds? Because I know, Cody, you mentioned that, you're trying to kind of flip the build with some more TCU guys.
Yeah, I wanted to piggyback off the onslaught stuff, because I think, and I don't want to liken this Georgia offense and Stetson Bennett to Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs, but trying to carry over some of the stuff that we've learned from the NFL Showdown slates. Like, it's really easy to captain a popular quarterback when you have a bunch of pass catchers that he's going to spread the ball around to. It not only creates an opportunity where he can be the highest scoring player on the slate because he is spreading it out so much, it helps you get unique. So we've seen it in these Chiefs slates where, like, Justin Watson or Noah Gray or some of these guys that are very cheap and very low owned can help be the differentiator in those lineups with a very popular Patrick Mahomes at captain. And I kind of feel the same way looking through this Georgia offense tonight with, if you do play a very popular Stetson Bennett at captain, you've got 7, 8 maybe pass catchers that you could potentially run combos with in the flex, and at all various price points from, Brock Bowers all the way down to, the sub $2,000 range. So I do like that as one way to build those onslaughts while being unique. I think a way that you can go a little bit more balanced is in anticipating this game to be a little bit more competitive. And then with that, you can still get a Stetson Bennett double stack and get really highly projected lineups, but just bring it back with 3 TCU options from the other side, and just hope that the production is a little bit more condensed. Maybe Stetson gets there on the ground once and maybe throws a couple of touchdown passes as well. But on the other side, I think at the quarterback position, you got to start there with Max Duggan, who is going to run quite a bit. They're going to be forced into what is likely negative game script, so they're going to be passing quite a bit. And he has that type of dual threat upside where he could be the slate's top overall scorer as well. It's just that the options to pair him with on the TCU side are a little bit more limited, which I think Chris could talk about.
I want to add real quick something about Kendall Milton. So, TCU runs this very unique 3-3-5 defense, which you would think going against Georgia, a bunch of big 4- and 5-star offensive linemen, not the best idea, but they did very well against Michigan, all things considered, against the run. And there is a thought in the UGA kind of community that they will be forced to run a different style of rushing attack, which favors Kendall Milton. So there's a little bit more of like, I don't want to say narrative, but more of like a lean based on some potential strategy. We can never really guess what a college coach is ever going to do for obvious reasons, but there's a thought that it might lean more in Milton's favor, and he's super cheap. He also would benefit from a blowout, which I think is certainly possible. Dawan Edwards is a little bit different of a runner, and Kenny McIntosh is a different type of player as well. So they kind of have like a three-headed monster, like you mentioned, Pete, that, they all have different skill sets. And Milton is potentially one of those guys that could benefit from this unique 3-3-5 defense that TCU has.
Right. Well, let's talk about TCU, because we've been on the TCU bandwagon all year. I feel like our group was playing Duggan ahead of other people, especially when there was some uncertainty. Got some huge games out of Duggan this year. But on the other side, the other player that we've played a lot and unfortunately got injured during the game for the semis is Kendre Miller. And I think that's the really only piece of news we have to watch for. We're assuming him in based on everything I'm seeing right now, based on having a projection on the solver, but severely limited. And he's really expensive. So that really brings DiRicardo back into play, who has a higher projection, lower price. I'm concerned just watching Miller on the sidelines last game, and then he tried to come back in for a play and just wasn't right. What's your sense, Chris, on kind of how this plays out? Obviously, right now we have Miller projected for severely limited, and then plays going to DiRicardo and obviously the passing game.
Yeah, I think right now everybody says it's 50-50. It's one of those going to test it on the field types. My concern as a DFS player would be they call him in or they don't say he's out, right? They don't have to in college football. And he pulls kind of like a Mayan Williams from Ohio State, gets a couple carries, maybe he gets one or two bigger snaps, and then that's it, right? Yeah. He's very expensive. And this is also against a really good Georgia defense. So it's one of those situations where I don't know if it's worth risking to spend up and to use a guy like Kendre when we know he's not going to be 100%. He's got an incredibly difficult matchup, and the game script doesn't go in his favor. DiMercado is a decent running back. It's kind of one of those situations where TCU just produces good running backs, right? Kendre Miller is an NFL prospect for sure. I don't know about that with DiMercado. And so I would be leery to use DiMercado even too, because we could see Kendre, dig into those snaps. If he was out from the jump, you're looking at about 55% guaranteed rushing usage there, which is nice, which at that price you definitely need to be using. But I think what we're ultimately going to see is both of them. I mean, obviously DiMercado in, but Miller not ruled out. And then there's that indecision of, how many snaps are we realistically going to get out of Miller?
Right. And I think, Miller, if you want to get crazy, you could play him, but I'm probably going to fade him just given the injury stuff, the price. And I agree. I mean, just watching that last game, I'd have to get really positive news to feel comfortable putting him in lineups where I wouldn't even be excited to play him if he was 100% healthy, just because of the way I expect this game to play out. Now, the receivers for TCU are interesting, and we'll start with Quentin Johnson, who's projected to be the number one receiver taken in the draft. I actually don't think he's as good of a college receiver as like Marvin Harrison, but he's certainly up there. He's 6'4", absolute freak athlete. I believe in high school he was like a high jumper or something like that. He's going to run really fast for the 40, something like 4.3, 4.4, projected to be a top 10 pick. So that's really interesting. I think he's going to soak up a lot of ownership in this showdown slate. How are you handling him and the rest of the receivers for TCU?
I think Johnston is really interesting, right? Big time prospect. He's very comparable to Marvin Harrison. I think we all agree Harrison is that like potential superstar receiver next in the NFL. And Johnston certainly could be that guy as well, but similar sizes. Harrison was incredible against Georgia and Keely Ringo. I can imagine that's their best corner. They're going to put him on Johnston. So that type of matchup's really intriguing for me. I'm curious how much they double him, seeing what happened with Harrison. And in that case, you have 2 or 3 different TCU guys that are big play threats, right? That's Tay Barber, Darius Davis, and then Savion Williams. They're very much boom or bust types. The thing is, you're going to get 2 catches for 12 yards, or you're going to get 3 catches for $140 and 2 touchdowns. Like, that's just the type of production they have. What's really interesting is that they're very differently priced compared to Georgia. Like, the way both teams use their receivers are near identical. They spread them all out. Like, there's 5 or 6 receivers in total, maybe, besides Johnston, with like Jordan Hudson, and Cartwright and Gunnar Henderson that get snaps, but they're priced way more aggressively. So I think those dart throws are certainly going to come from the Georgia side. So I think we will see some low usage and ownership on Davis and Barber and Williams. So I like the 3 of them, but I need to think that I need that script of they're going to be pass heavy, which is great, but how are they going to handle? How is Georgia going to handle Johnston? I think after the first half, we'll know, hey, if this isn't working, Kirby's a smart guy. They have a great coaching staff. They'll make some adjustments. But I definitely want a piece of all 3 of those guys, but I certainly won't plant my flag on one of them, I think, at this point.
Right. And I think if you're Georgia, I don't know if they'll double the entire game, but you're definitely going to have a safety over the top, because what Quentin Johnston wants to do is run downfield. Duggan loves to throw him jump balls. I mean, he's just an absolute beast. So I think, you would just always want a safety over the top there. Cody, in terms of kind of some rules and just how you're thinking through the slate, what are some things from a lineup construction standpoint that you're trying to be cognizant of?
Yeah, one thing that is kind of starting to stand out, particularly in these 4-2 roster constructions that are going to be very popular tonight with the Georgia heavy stuff. I think we're going to see, some combination of Stetson Bennett, Kenny McIntosh, Brock Bowers as kind of the 3 pay up options on the Georgia side. And then as Chris alluded to, you just have all of these really cheap wide receivers in this wide receiver rotation who I think are going to get played quite a bit. A.D. Mitchell, Pierce Jackson will be played some, I believe. Dominic Blaylock. I think it's just going to be like, give me the top 3 guys from Georgia. Let me mix in one of these value options, and then I should have enough money left over to pay up for the 2 studs from TCU. And so I think that that's going to be a very popular roster construction tonight. So like doing something like Chris said, where the TCU dart throws are worse from a per dollar perspective, Darius Davis, Tay Barber, and Savion Williams. But the type of wide range of outcomes that Chris is outlining is something that's really interesting in large field tournaments to me. I don't mind if I accept some of those 2 for 12 games if I'm going to get paid off with 7 to 15% projected ownership. So I think flipping the build a little bit in that way by just paying, kind of flipping the salary construction here with some of these guys on the TCU side makes sense. One rule that I could throw this back to Chris too to get his perspective on, like if I want to play a Quentin Johnson captain lineup, I most likely want to pair him with Max Duggan. We can go through and set up some of those rules. If you have Quentin Johnson at captain, would you completely remove all of the other TCU wide receivers from play, given their price tags and given the fact that you're most likely in that outcome playing for a true alpha game from Quentin Johnson? Or is it okay to play those guys alongside one another?
I think it's okay to do it, but I think I'd lean more in the cheaper TCU guys. I think Jared Wiley, a tight end for them, he's going to get a lot of run there. I think like Jordan Hudson was, I think he's one of the highest rated prospects to ever go to TCU. He's a true freshman that saw an uptick in usage last week or in last game. Those are the types of guys I think I would be more inclined to use alongside Johnson, because I don't need the huge game. I don't need 15, 20 points. If I get 8, 10 points out of one of those 2, that's great. And then I can pair it up with, it's something maybe a little bit more chalky with like a Stetson, McIntosh, Bowers type, but I think I would lean more on those cheap ones like Hudson and Wiley there.
How are you guys thinking about the kickers? Because that's the other thing that, to me, the kickers is an interesting spot here, specifically on the Georgia side. I think onslaughts can certainly make sense with a kicker. I'm not that interested in the TCU kicker, but that's just because of the nature of this game and how I'm expecting it to play out. Chris, you have any sense on how you're going to handle the kickers?
I'm with you. I believe it's Kell is the TCU kicker. I'm not a big fan of him, all things considered. Podlesny, though, from Georgia, is a great kicker, and he's
Yep.
relatively cheap. Like I could see all they have to do is get slowed down in the red zone twice, and he's 6-7 points. Not to mention they're going to probably score 2, 3, 4 touchdowns, right? So all those extra points. So I like Podlesny. I definitely won't use him over some of these high upside guys like an Arian Smith, or definitely not an AD Mitchell, but is a unique, maybe a little bit of a variation play for sure. I think he's in play.
Yeah, that's kind of and for the onslaughts, I think that makes sense. I mean, there's a lot of scenarios here where Georgia, I think, just absolutely crushes them. And I think in those scenarios, the kicker could make sense. Any desire, Cody, to do like a 4-2 TCU? I might do that as like I don't think that's likely, but you're going to get such good ownership on like a onslaught, or not even an onslaught, but like a 4-2 TCU build. You can still play like Bowers and McIntosh and Stenson with that. Any desire to potentially throw something like that in there?
Yeah, I think after hearing you guys talk through the game and hearing that Rufus makes Georgia, minus 18, I think I'm going to lean into the popular construction more so than I was coming into the show. Going to lean in more to the Georgia side than I had anticipated. But I do think, and this is one nice thing that we can do with the solver. If you're following along, you can go into the advanced settings and you can set a minimum rule for how much you want, or maximum rule for how much you want of any given stack. And I think for me, just as maybe a hedge off the rest of my MME player pool tonight, I will do, something like maybe 5% TCU 4-2 side. So I think that's an interesting way you can get a little bit of a spread on your MME portfolio and have some exposure if this game does play closer than the 13-point spread. If this game, maybe if TCU pulls off a miraculous upset, then you have some of that exposure to what will still be highly projected lineups, but will just be in favor of the TCU side.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. The way I see TCU competing in this game and where this isn't a blowout is turnovers. They did that against Michigan, and if they can get turnovers in this game, that's how it would work out. So, I think that there's some validity to that, just given how low owned it's going to be. I'm definitely going to be jamming a bunch of 5-1 Georgia stuff, though. So it should be a fun slate. Any other rules, Cody, that you want to talk through in terms of how you're thinking about the slate?
Yeah, I do highly encourage you guys to check out the site. I think Chris and Gallon put these rules together. You guys can copy and paste them one for one. I think a lot of these rules make sense and are things that are applicable in NFL Showdown as well, and kind of play onto this side as well. The one thing that, as we've talked through it now, the 5-1 being popular and the 5-1 being the side that most of us want to play into, there's this option underneath the advanced settings in the solver optimizer. You can go through and you can set up your lineups based off of the stacks that you're playing or based off of the rosters that you're playing. So if you are playing 5-1 and you want to control what type of, what types of players end up in those 5-1 lineups, you can set that up here by doing something like any 5-player Georgia stack needs to include or boost. You can all kinds of options here. Like for me, I would want to boost Stetson Bennett captain in these, and you can kind of play with how much you want to boost him. Maybe it's 10%, maybe it's 15%. I would imagine you're probably going to get a lot of Stetson Bennett captain in your 5-1 stacks naturally. But this is one way to control for, okay, I think Georgia wins. I think they handle the 13-point spread. And in doing so, it's more likely in those outcomes that Stetson Bennett is spreading the ball around. So I want to make sure I get Stetson Bennett at captain. And you can add other items here, like you could boost the pass catchers on the TCU side. Let's say, we think it's a 5-1 blowout. We want to get some of these guys like Darius Davis and Tay Barber and Savion Williams on the bring back as ways to get a little bit more unique. You can boost those guys because we know these pass catchers on a PPR friendly site like DraftKings definitely going to give us more receptions in garbage time. So I think just playing through these rules, check out the article on the site for some of these other rules that Chris and Gallon wrote up. And it's a really, really nice way to control the types of lineups that you're getting in the game script that you're projecting.
One rule that Glenn and I have been kind of utilizing more recently is something like a Max Duggan captain. I probably want to boost his receivers because they don't necessarily rate well compared to their pricing, right? The value isn't there like those UGA guys, those 3rd, 4th, 5th options there. And then ultimately too, right, if you're going to get a Max Duggan captain, you probably want to dock a guy like DeMercado. He's not used a ton in the passing game, and he's really going to rely on a good running game and a touchdown, which Duggan can do everything around the goal line as well. So something like that makes a lot of sense as well. You could even play around with like a Kenny McIntosh captain, maybe a Doc Dawan Edwards. Something like that could be interesting as well. It's been fun to kind of utilize these different things. The only thing I've done is kick myself learning about some of these things late in the season compared to maybe middle of the season when some of this stuff was released.
Chris, I want to ask you, because we talked about all of these kind of wide receiver rotations for Georgia, wide receiver rotations for TCU. Are there any like direct 1v1 or 1-for-1 playing time competition spots on the Georgia side or the TCU side that you would set either a max one rule for a couple of players, or can seriously consider a doc for one player if the other is in a lineup?
I don't necessarily think so. The one interesting guy we haven't spoken about is Ladd McConkey. And that maybe falls into this conversation of who benefits from, right? So Ladd McConkey, he hurt his knee late in the season. He was clearly banged up against Ohio State, but I think he had 4 targets for -1 yards. But he did have a 2-point conversion play, and he did have a 50-yard target that was wiped away due to penalty. If he is banged up or doesn't play, a guy like Marcus Rosemy Jack Saint and Arian Smith immediately see a bump up for me. Those are kind of, those are guys that probably going to go from 8 to 12 passing snaps to like a guaranteed 15 to 20. Those are both those kind of other side of the field receivers from A.D. Mitchell. I think A.D. Mitchell is locked in for, essentially the entire passing attack for tonight. But it's those guys like Jack Saint, Arian Smith, that would really benefit from a Ladd McConkey 50% usage, 50% health type game.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And it kind of helps spread out your exposure and get the right types of guys and the right types of lineups and not pairing players who are directly going to eat into each other's upsides.
Yeah, I think that's all really sharp stuff. It should be a great game. We definitely have to get out of here with a fly plan. We will do that. But Chris, any other final thoughts here on the game before we do our flag plans?
I don't think so. I think we've covered everything. The other injury concern is very minimal. It's Darnell Washington, the tight end. And this goes into the groups a little bit discussion. I'm maxing 2 tight ends out of Georgia. Oscar Delp is that 3rd tight end, big recruit that everybody loves, freshman. He's not going to see any playing time if Darnell Washington is playing. So I'm definitely maxing 2 of those 3. But Washington, I believe it's an ankle injury. He wasn't seen with a boot, but he was limping pretty heavily getting on the plane the other day. I don't suspect he plays or plays much at all. We have him, I think, very limited. But yeah, I think that's really the last kind of note before flag plans.
Okay. Well, great. It's important, and definitely monitor the news. We will absolutely have it before, like Chris mentioned, just because they don't, a player can get ruled in like Miller and still not play much. It's definitely different rules than the NFL, but just be thoughtful about what you're doing. In terms of flag plants, I'll start us off. I'm going to go with Brock Bowers. Only 4 catches, 64 yards against Ohio State, but in games where they were pushed even a little bit, he had some monster games, and games that were blowouts too. He had some big games, and I expect him to have a big game here. NFL prospect, like Chris mentioned, just a big player, 6'4", 230, and they get him the ball in a lot of ways, especially in the red zone, screen passes, seam routes. He's just someone who's a monster in the red zone. So I'm expecting a big game from Bowers. Expect him to score, and he's my flag plant. Chris, I'll kick it to you, and then we'll kick it to Cody.
I'll go another prospect. Lots of NFL prospects, not surprisingly here, but I'll go Quentin Johnston. I think he is potentially in line for a huge game. What would Marvin Harrison have ended up with if he didn't get hurt kind of middle of that 4th quarter? How would that game have ended? I just think the only way TCU has success is if they feed him the ball, especially with, in my opinion, a super limited Kendre Miller, right? They're going to become, I think, a little bit more passing heavy than we think. And I think he's going to see a ton of targets. I like him in the captain spot. I think I put him as kind of a leverage play as that Quentin Johnston captain. He's probably going to be like the 4th or 5th highest owned captain, and I think that's a really great spot to kind of attack. So I'll go with Johnston.
All right, Cody, your flag plant, and we can get out of here.
Yeah, I like both of those quite a bit. I think those should be staples in tournament winning lineups. I'm going to go a little bit further down the board, maybe give somebody a little bit of a leverage play, a little bit of a kind of a dart throw for the flagship on DraftKings. I think one of these secondary TCU wide receivers might be able to have a big game, and it could be an inefficient performance. It could be due to garbage time late, but I think somebody like Darius Davis, Tay Barber, or Savion Williams could end up in a winning lineup just as a result of racking up PPR volume late in the game. I'm going to side with the most expensive guy of the group, as hopefully that will help to limit ownership a little bit. And Darius Davis, I think Darius Davis, whether it be a part of 4-2 or 5-1 type Georgia onslaughts, I think Darius Davis ends up being a part of a winning lineup tonight.
Awesome. Well, this is really fun. I hope we have more of these college football shows in the future. Chris, it was great being with you all season, and Cody, keep up all the great work. I've watched a ton of the content at ETR for the showdowns and learned a lot from you. And of course, make sure you check out the solver. All of this is free for the college football championship game. Please give us feedback. We're proud of this product. And I think, especially for this game tonight, should be a lot of fun. So hopefully someone takes down a bunch of money. Good luck tonight. And thanks, Chris and Cody, again for the show. See you guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.